The heavy velvet curtains in the upstairs window smelled of old dust and her mother's expensive French perfume. Elena's fingers found the thin, worn spot in the crimson fabric, the thread smooth from her touch every single night. Outside, the warm June air was sweet with jasmine. Inside, the grand piano in the bellow played a perfect, icy Chopin nocturne. It was June 12, 1986, and another diplomatic party at the ambassador's residence on Embassy Row in Washington, D.C. was ending. Elena Romanov, 17 years old, stood perfectly still behind the glass, a silent ghost in her own home. She watched the important men and their elegant wives drift down the stone steps to their waiting cars. The women's jewels caught the light from the porch lanterns, sparkling like trapped fireflies. Laughter, polite and hollow, floated up to her. The taste in her mouth was warm, flat champagne, a single stolen sip from a forgotten glass on a hallway tray. It was a tiny rebellion, bitter and sweet at the same time. This was her ritual. 9 o'clock to midnight, every party night. Her world was a beautiful script written by someone else. Smile politely. Speak 3 languages flawlessly. Be a perfect portrait on the wall. From her second-floor window, she knew every detail. The crack in the third stone step, the way Mr. Henderson from the trade office always lingered too long saying goodbye, the particular purr of the black Mercedes engines. Tonight, though, something was different. Her eyes, usually drifting over the scene like a calm lake, stuck on a single point. Leo, the new driver hired just 3 weeks ago, was not heading towards the staff quarters behind the garage. He stood under the big old oak tree at the edge of the driveway, half in shadow. He had finished closing the door of her father's official car, a long black ZL imported from home. But he wasn't leaving. He was just standing there. And he wasn't looking at the house, or at the departing guests. He was looking directly up, through the branches, at her window. A jolt went through Elena, sharp and electric. No one ever looked up. She was part of the scenery, a silhouette everyone politely ignored. His gaze wasn't casual. It was steady, a quiet question in the dark. It felt like a hand had gently knocked on the glass between her world and everything else. Her breath hitched, fogging a tiny circle on the pane. She didn't move. Could he even see her, tucked behind the deep red velvet? Downstairs, the piano music stopped abruptly. The final, social murmur of voices faded. She heard the deep, familiar sound of her father's voice thanking the last guest. This was the signal. The performance was over. She should step back, let the curtain fall, get ready for bed. But her feet were rooted to the Persian rug. Leo, under the tree, hadn't moved either. Then, the sound. The heavy, oak front door of the residence shut with a solid, echoing asterisk thud star. It was a sound of finality. It vibrated through the polished floorboards, traveled up the walls, and settled in Elena's bones. In the sudden silence it left behind, the grand hall clock began to chime midnight. Asterisk bong. 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 Asterisk each note was slow and deep, swallowing the last echoes of the evening. When the last chime faded into the quiet house, Elena looked back to the oak tree. The space under it was empty. Leo was gone. A strange emptiness filled the spot where he had stood. The night was just a night again. The window was just a window. She let the velvet curtain fall from her fingers. The room behind her was large and beautiful, filled with books she'd read 100 times and furniture that wasn't meant to be touched. It felt different now. The air seemed thinner. As she turned to go to her bed, the memory of that direct, upward glance was a bright, burning spot in her mind. And the silence in the house wasn't peaceful anymore. It was listening. For the next week, the memory of that look under the oak tree didn't fade. It grew. It became a secret she carried with her through her days of tutors and piano practice and formal dinners. She found herself noticing other things. Leo was 20, with serious eyes and hair the color of wheat. He was always perfectly professional, holding doors, staring straight ahead when she got into the car. But sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, she saw a quick, quiet smile touch his lips. She saw him once, wiping a smudge off the car's bumper with a careful, almost loving attention. The house had many rules, spoken and unspoken. One of the biggest was the invisible line between the family and the staff. It was a line made of polished silver, silent nods, and empty spaces. You existed in separate worlds, even under the same roof. To cross it was unthinkable. It was like trying to breathe in a room with no air. But an idea began to form in Elena's mind. A crazy, dangerous little idea. It started with a book. She was reading a book of poetry by Anna Akhmatova, a poet her father's government did not approve of. The words were about love and loss and a stifled country, and they made her heart ache with a recognition she couldn't explain. On Thursday, July 3rd, she had a French lesson downtown. Leo was driving. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The note was simple, just a line from a poem. Asterisk, we aged 100 years, and this happened in a single hour. Asterisk, she didn't sign it. As she got out of the car on M Street, the leather seat warm from the summer sun, she let the small, folded paper slip from her fingers. It fell into the narrow gap between the driver's headrest and the seat. A tiny, white secret in the dark space. The drive home was agony. She stared out the window at the passing buildings, her palms damp. What had she done? It was a stupid, childish game. He would find it, he would be offended, or scared, and he would report it to the security chief. Her father would be informed. The consequences rolled out in her mind like a dark carpet. She felt sick. Nothing happened the next day. Or the day after. The sky didn't fall. On Saturday morning, however, she had a trip to the library. When she opened the car door to get in, the book of Akhmatova's poetry was lying on the back seat. Her book. She'd left it in her room. A cold fear washed over her. He had been in her room? No, impossible. The housekeeper must have brought it down. She slid into the seat and picked up the book. It fell open to the page with the poem she had quoted. There, in the margin next to the line, was a small, neat check mark in pencil. And underneath it, another line from further down the page was underlined. Asterisk, but I warn you, I am living for the last time. Asterisk. The world outside the car window, the trees, the sky, the other cars, seemed to sharpen, to become incredibly vivid. The air inside the car, smelling of clean leather and the faint, crisp scent of peppermint, felt charged, like before a storm. She didn't look at the back of his head in the driver's seat. She just closed the book, held it tightly in her lap, and watched the city go by. A silent conversation had begun. A thread, thinner than silk and stronger than steel, now connected the front seat and the back seat. It connected the upstairs window and the space under the oak tree. That thread, that secret, felt alive. It felt like hope. It felt, for the first time in her carefully arranged life, like a real, breathing thing. She had no idea where it would lead, or what price it might carry. All she knew was that in a world of velvet curtains and closed doors, she had just whispered a hello into the silence. And the silence had whispered back. The book felt heavy in Elena's lap, like it was made of lead instead of paper. The car's engine was a low hum, and the streets of Washington, D.C. blurred past the window in a smear of summer green and grey stone. But inside the black ZIL, the air was perfectly still. She could see the back of Leo's head, his cap set straight, his eyes fixed on the road ahead in the rearview mirror. He gave no sign. No smile, no glance. He was just the driver. But the proof was right there in her hands. The simple pencil line under those words, asterisk, but I warn you, I am living for the last time. Asterisk, her heart wasn't hammering anymore. It was doing something stranger. It felt too big for her chest, a warm, expanding balloon of pure, terrifying wonder. He had read the poem. He had understood. And he had answered. That was the beginning of the secret life. The one that existed in the margins of books and in the quiet space of the car. It became their only place. In the grand, echoing house on Embassy Row, Elena was the ambassador's daughter. She practiced Chopin for an hour each afternoon in the music room where the sunlight made the dust dance. She discussed politics with her father's guests, using the polite, empty phrases she'd been taught. She wore the dresses laid out for her, blue silk or pale linen. But in the back of the car, she was someone else. She started leaving books on purpose. A worn copy of Hemingway's *A Movable Feast*, with a paragraph about Paris circled. A book of American nature essays, with a description of the Colorado River starred. She would place it on the seat when she got out, her fingers leaving it behind almost casually. And always, the next time she rode with him, the book would be returned. A single word might be underlined. A question mark would appear in a margin. Once, a tiny, perfectly drawn sketch of a bird was on the back page of a poetry collection. He never spoke. Not about this. The only sounds were the turn of the engine, the swish of the tires on rain-damp streets, the distant honk of other traffic. Their entire world was built on silence and ink. Yet, Elena had never felt more heard in her entire life. Then, one Tuesday in late August, she took the biggest risk yet. The house was preparing for a major reception for a visiting general. The air was thick with tension, with the smell of polished silver and the sharp scent of lilies from massive flower arrangements. Her father was short-tempered. The security detail, led by a stern man named Boris, seemed to be everywhere, their eyes missing nothing. Elena had a piano lesson that afternoon. As Leo held the car door open for her, she didn't slip a book onto the seat. Instead, she pressed a small, folded square of her own stationery into the narrow gap where the window met the door, on his side. Her fingers trembled. It wasn't a poem this time. It was a question. The East Garden Wall. The ivy is thick there. 10 p.m. The hours until nightfall were an agony. Every tick of the clock in the hallway was a loud drumbeat. At dinner, she pushed food around her plate, her ears straining for any unusual sound from the staff quarters. Her father asked her about her lesson, and she answered in a voice that sounded thin and far away to her own ears. She was sure everyone could see the secret screaming from her face. Finally, it was time. The grandfather clock chimed 10:15. The party downstairs was a dull roar of conversation and clinking glasses. She slipped from her room, wearing a dark sweater over her dress, her feet bare on the cool wooden floors. The house was a maze of shadow and slivers of light from under closed doors. She knew how to avoid the creaky board on the main staircase, how to open the side door to the terrace without a sound. The night air outside was a shock, cool and damp, smelling of wet soil and night-blooming flowers. It felt alive. The noise of the party faded behind her, replaced by the chirp of crickets. Her heart was a wild thing in her throat as she hurried across the dewy grass towards the east garden, towards the old brick wall shrouded in dark ivy. He wasn't there. A crushing weight settled in her stomach. She stood in the deep shadow, the rough brick cold against her back. 5 minutes passed. 10. The hope that had carried her there began to leak away, leaving her feeling foolish and very, very cold. Of course he wasn't coming. It was too dangerous. It had all been a game in a book, and she had mistaken it for something real. She was about to turn, to slip back into the golden cage of the house, when she heard the softest crunch of gravel. Not from the garden path, but from the other side of the wall. From the alley beyond the property line. A hand appeared over the top of the wall, fingers grasping the old brick. Then another. And then Leo pulled himself up and over, dropping to the ground beside her with a soft thud. He wasn't in his uniform. He wore a simple, dark jacket. He was breathing a little heavily from the climb. For a long moment, they just looked at each other in the faint light from a distant street lamp. It was the first time they had stood face to face without glass or car seats between them. "This is a trap," he said, his voice low and rough, almost a whisper. It was the first thing he had ever said to her that wasn't "good morning" or "your door, miss." Elena's breath caught. "It's not," she whispered back. "I swear it." He looked past her, towards the bright windows of the house. "You shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be here." But he didn't leave. And that's when they heard the voices. Not from the party, but from the terrace. Male voices, serious and getting closer. A beam from a flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the lawn. Without a word, Leo grabbed her hand. His hand was warm and rough, and his grip was firm. He pulled her deeper into the shadow of the wall, into a recess where the ivy was thickest. They pressed against the cold bricks, side by side, so close she could feel the heat from his arm and hear his quick, shallow breathing. The flashlight beam danced over the grass just feet away, illuminating the very spot where she had been standing. "Check the perimeter before the general departs," a voice said. It was Boris, the security chief. "Everything must be secure." The other man mumbled a reply. Their footsteps crunched on the gravel path, so close Elena could smell Boris's cigarette smoke. She closed her eyes, praying her pounding heart wasn't as loud as it sounded in her own ears. Leo's hand was still wrapped around hers, a tight anchor in the spinning dark. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. The light faded. The garden was quiet again, save for the crickets. Leo let go of her hand as if it had burned him. He took a step back, creating a space between them that felt colder than the night air. His face was pale in the dim light, his eyes wide not with romance, but with a fear she had been too naive to consider. "They're watching," he said, his voice flat. "Not just the house. *me. Boris asked me today why I was loitering by the service gate last week." He looked at her, and the expression in his eyes was a terrible, clear mirror. He knew I was somewhere I shouldn't be. He was warning me. The words landed like stones. The East Garden Wall. The hidden note. The sense of a thrilling, private game. It all shattered in an instant. Elena had been so focused on her own loneliness, on the beautiful secret, that she never stopped to think about the danger for him. For Leo, this wasn't a game of poetry. A single misstep could cost him his job, his visa, his future. The house's eyes weren't just on her. They were on everyone, and they had seen him step out of line. The magic of the whispered secret curdled into something else. The cold, hard understanding that she had been careless with someone else's life. The ivy on the wall wasn't a romantic hideaway. It was a place of risk. The look they shared now wasn't one of connection, but of shared, dawning fear. He turned and, without another word, hoisted himself back over the wall, disappearing into the darkness of the alley. This time, he didn't look back. Elena stood alone in the shadow of the wall, the chill from the bricks seeping through her sweater. From the house, the sound of the party continued, a distant melody, a burst of laughter. It sounded like it was coming from another planet. She looked down at her hand, the one he had held. It felt empty now, and terribly young. She had reached for a spark of light, and for a moment, she had held it. But now she saw the truth. She had been holding a match in a room full of gasoline, and she hadn't even known it. The question wasn't about poetry anymore. It was a much harder one. What do you do when your hope becomes someone else's trap? The morning after the garden wall felt like waking up in a different world. The familiar bedroom, the cream-colored walls, the shelf of books, the view of the oak tree, was the same, but the air in it had changed. It was heavier. Elena dressed mechanically, the memory of Leo's frightened eyes in the dark and the grip of his hand replaying over and over. A cold knot of dread had taken up permanent residence just beneath her ribs. For 3 days, life carried on with a horrible normalcy. The fallen leaves from the oak tree were raked into neat, damp piles. Her father left for the embassy each morning, his briefcase snapping shut with a sound like a gunshot. But Elena noticed the new details. Boris, the security chief, seemed to be in the hallway more often. He would nod to her, his face blank as stone, and his presence felt less like protection and more like a silent audit. She saw him watching the staff come and go from the kitchen yard, his eyes missing nothing. Then, on Friday, the summons came. Her father's study was a room she usually entered for praise or for gentle corrections about her posture or pronunciation. Today, the smell of leather and old paper felt suffocating. A fire crackled in the hearth, throwing jumping shadows on the wall of books, but no warmth reached her. "Elena, sit," her father said, not looking up from his desk. His pen scratched across a document. "There is a matter to discuss." He spoke about the future, about stability, about alliances that strengthened a family's position. He mentioned a name, Alexei Volkov, a junior cultural attaché at the embassy. 28 years old. From a good family. A rising star. He has expressed an interest in being introduced properly, her father said, finally looking at her. His gaze was analytical, like he was assessing a painting. He will be at the winter ball next month. You will dance with him. It wasn't a question. It was a blueprint, drawn in invisible ink that was now becoming starkly visible. The words washed over her. Duties, advantages, sensible choices. They were the bricks of the life she had always known, and now they were being laid in a specific, unchangeable path. The knot in her stomach tightened. She thought of pencil marks in book margins, of a shared, silent language that required no words of diplomacy. She managed to nod. She managed to say, "I understand, Father." The words tasted like dust. Leaving the study, the grand hallway felt like a tunnel. Her feet on the polished marble were the only sound. As she passed the main drawing room, she saw him. Alexei Volkov. He was speaking with another attaché, a polished, handsome man with a confident smile. He held a glass of brandy, swirling it slowly as he laughed at something. His eyes, sharp and appraising, swept across the hall and landed on her. He gave a small, knowing nod. A chill that had nothing to do with the October air went through her. This was the man her father had chosen. This was the future, smiling and swirling brandy. Panic, pure and desperate, began to rise in her throat. She had to see Leo. She had to explain, to warn him, to somehow fix the danger she had drawn him into. She scribbled a new note, her handwriting jagged with fear. *I am so sorry. We must talk. The same place. Tonight, 11. She didn't quote poetry. This was beyond poetry. Getting the note to him was a nightmare of timing. She finally managed to slip it onto the driver's seat of the Park ZL in the garage, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure the engine block could hear it. Night fell early now, a deep, cold purple. The house settled into its evening rhythms. At 5 minutes to 11, wrapped in her darkest coat, Elena once again became a ghost in her own home. She moved past closed doors, down the back staircase, and out into the biting cold. The east garden was a landscape of skeletons, bare branches against a cloudy sky, the flower beds just mounds of dark earth. The ivy on the wall was brown and brittle. She waited, shivering, her breath making small clouds in the air. Every rustle of a dead leaf made her jump. The clock in the house began to chime 11, its sound swallowed by the thick night. Then, a shadow moved at the top of the wall. Relief flooded her, so powerful it made her knees weak. He had come. But the figure that dropped down was taller, bulkier. It landed with a heavy, sure-footed thud. And it didn't step into the shadow. It stepped into a pale slice of light from a security lamp. It was Alexei Volkov. He brushed a bit of dirt from his perfectly tailored sleeve and smiled, the same polished smile from the drawing room. "Elena," he said, his voice smooth. "A bit cold for a garden stroll, don't you think?" The world tilted. Her blood seemed to freeze solid in her veins. How? The note. The car. He must have been watching Leo. He must have found it first. I needed air," she stammered, taking a step back. "Of course," he said, his tone agreeable. He took a step forward. Seeking inspiration, perhaps? From the ivy. Or perhaps from a certain driver. He let the question hang in the cold air. A word of advice, from someone who cares for your family's reputation. These little adventures, they are beneath you, and they are dangerous for those without your protection. He said protection like it was a threat. He knew. He knew everything. And he was letting her know that he knew. It was a display of power, quiet and absolute. Before she could form a word, before the crushing humiliation and terror could fully drown her, they both heard a soft scrape from the other side of the wall. Alexei's smile widened, a predator's grin. He turned expectantly towards the sound. Leo's head and shoulders appeared over the wall. He was coming, just as she'd asked. His eyes found Elena first, filled with a worried urgency. Then they shifted to the man standing beside her, smirking in the lamplight. All the color drained from Leo's face. He froze, his fingers turning white where they gripped the cold brick. "Ah, the diligent chauffeur," Alexei said, his voice loud enough to carry. "Checking the perimeter? How commendable." He looked back at Elena, his message clear. Asterisk, see what your carelessness has done. See what I can make happen. Asterisk. Leo didn't say a word. His eyes locked with Elena's for one endless second. A look of betrayal, of fear, of final understanding. Then he was gone, disappearing back into the alley's darkness without a sound. Alexei turned back to her, his performance complete. "You should go inside, Elena. You'll catch a chill." He gave a slight, mocking bow and walked back towards the house, leaving her alone in the freezing garden. She didn't remember moving. She found herself in the linen closet on the second floor, a small, dark space that smelled of lavender and bleach. She slid down against the shelves of crisp sheets, her body shaking uncontrollably. In the dim light from the hallway under the door, she caught her reflection in the glass front of a cabinet. The girl staring back was a stranger, pale, wide-eyed, foolish. This was the mirror moment. She wasn't a brave heroine in a secret romance. She was a naive girl who had played with fire, thinking it was a fairy light. She had been so lonely, so hungry for a real connection, that she had spun a shared glance and some penciled lines into a grand rebellion. But her rebellion had luxury. His had consequences. She had drawn him into the sightlines of men like Alexei, who saw people as pawns on a chessboard. She had offered friendship, but what she had really given him was a target on his back. The impossible choice laid itself out before her, clear and cruel. She could go to her father. She could confess her childish infatuation, take all the blame. She would be punished, probably sent back to live with a stern aunt in Leningrad. But her confession might clear Leo, might label him as the subject of a silly girl's crush, not an active participant. He would be safe, but she would be exiled, and any fragile thread between them would be severed forever. Or she could say nothing. She could play the obedient daughter, dance with Alexei at the ball, and let the suspicion fall on Leo alone. Boris and Alexei would watch him, waiting for a mistake. His life here would become unbearable. He might be fired, sent home in disgrace. She could keep her place in this gilded world, but the cost would be watching from her window as a good man was destroyed for the crime of answering her whisper. She hugged her knees to her chest in the dark closet. The cold from the garden was deep inside her now, in her bones. She had wanted a story from a book, but this was not a book. This was the heavy, complicated weight of real life, where every choice hurt someone. 2 days later, the news came, delivered by her mother over breakfast in the sunlit morning room. It was said casually, between sips of tea. "Oh, that nice young driver, Leo? He's being transferred. The motor pool at the embassy needs reliable hands, they say. He'll be gone by the end of the week." The words were a physical blow. Asterisk transferred. Asterisk not fired. Not arrested. Moved out of reach, cleanly and efficiently. It was Alexei's work. A neat, polite solution. Elena sat perfectly still, the strawberry jam on her toast suddenly looking too red, too sweet. The sunlight felt like a lie. And then Elena realized their secret was a lie. It had never been theirs to keep. It had always belonged to the house, to the men who made the rules, to the world that decided where people belonged. Their beautiful, silent understanding had been an illusion. They were just pieces on a board, and someone else was moving them. The game, it seemed, was already over. The only question left was whether she had the courage to stop playing by the rules that had just broken her heart. The news of the transfer sat inside Elena like a stone. Gone by the end of the week. It was Thursday. The clock on the wall, with its ornate brass hands, seemed to be spinning. She moved through the next 2 days in a strange, quiet daze. She was present for her lessons, her fingers playing the correct piano notes, her voice reciting French verbs. But inside, she was watching herself from a great distance, seeing a girl in a beautiful, silent movie. Her first instinct was a storm of grief and guilt. She wanted to find Leo, to apologize, to scream at the injustice. But that was the old Elena, the one who reacted with her heart first. That Elena had caused this mess. The stone of cold realization in her stomach hardened into something else, a sharp, clear focus. She had been an observer her whole life. It was her flaw. She watched from windows, she noticed details others missed, but she never acted on what she saw. She absorbed the world like a quiet sponge. Now, that very flaw, her silent, watchful nature, was the only weapon she had. She began to remember. Not the poetry, but the practical things. The things she had seen and filed away because she had nothing else to do. She remembered Alexei Volkov. Not his smile, but his habits. His late-night meetings in the guest study, a room that was supposed to be empty after 10 p.m. She remembered, one night months ago, being unable to sleep and walking the halls. She had passed the guest study and seen a thin line of light under the door, heard the low murmur of two voices. One was Alexei's, the other was unfamiliar, speaking in quick, tense Russian. She had heard the distinct click of a lock turning, and the muffled sound of a drawer opening and closing. She had thought nothing of it then. A diplomat working late. She remembered something else, too. The way Boris, the security chief, sometimes looked at Alexei. It wasn't with the blank respect he showed her father. It was a flicker of something else, wariness, maybe even dislike. Boris was old guard, loyal to the state first, to her father second. Alexei was new, ambitious, a climber. They were not on the same team. On Friday, the day before Leo was to be transferred, the house was in a frenzy of preparation for the winter ball. It was December 19th, silver and white decorations were being hung, turning the grand hall into a frosted palace. The scent of pine boughs and baking pastries filled the air. Elena's emerald green gown, heavy with silk and seed pearls, hung on her closet door, a costume for her final performance. That afternoon, she acted. She waited until the hallway outside the guest study was empty. Her heart was not fluttering nervously. It beat a slow, steady drum of purpose. She turned the brass doorknob. Locked, of course. But she knew where the spare key was kept, in the small, ugly vase on the hall console that her mother hated. A silly place, which is why it was perfect. The key turned with a soft snick star. The room inside was neat, impersonal. A desk, two chairs, a bookshelf of boring official reports. Her eyes went straight to the desk. The center drawer was locked. She knelt, her ear close to the old wood, and gently tugged on the drawer above it. It slid open, revealing pens and paper clips. She reached her hand into the deep space at the back of this upper drawer, feeling along the dusty top of the locked drawer below. Her fingers brushed against cold metal. A second key, taped to the wood. Her hands were perfectly steady as she unlocked the center drawer. Inside were not state secrets. They were better. There was a small, black address book, and a stack of receipts, not from government accounts, but from a local electronics store, for expensive shortwave radio equipment. There was a train ticket receipt to New York City from a weekend Alexei had claimed to be in Virginia, and a photograph of Alexei with a man at a cafe, a man Elena recognized from a diplomatic security briefing as a low-level official from an unfriendly embassy. It wasn't proof of spying, not outright, but it was proof of lies, proof of secret meetings, unauthorized trips, and contacts that would make Boris's hair stand on end. It was the smell of ambition turned rotten. To a man like Boris, to her father, this would be 1,000 times more serious than a driver exchanging poetry books with the daughter of the house. She didn't take anything. That would be theft, and she would be caught. Instead, she did something smarter. She took a clean sheet of the embassy stationery from the drawer, and she wrote, in her precise handwriting, a simple list. Asterisk item, 1 address book, black. Item, receipts, Radio Hut, dated November 15th and 30. Item, Amtrak receipt, Washington, New York, December 5th. Item, photograph, Cafe Milano. She folded the list, slipped it into the pocket of her dress, and locked everything back exactly as she had found it. She found Boris an hour later, inspecting the new security lighting on the terrace. He turned, his face its usual impassive mask. "Miss Elena." "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice calm. "It's about the guest study, and about Alexei Volkov." She saw the slight narrowing of his eyes. She didn't show him the list. She recited it from memory, her gaze steady on his. She described the hidden key, the drawer, the contents. She told him about the late-night voices months ago. She presented it not as a hysterical accusation, but as the concerned observations of a watchful daughter of the embassy. "I thought you should know what is happening under our roof," she finished, "before it becomes a problem for my father." Boris said nothing for a long moment. He studied her face, looking for the lie, the exaggeration. He saw only cold, clear certainty. The watchful girl had finally spoken, and what she said confirmed his own deepest suspicions. "I see," he said finally, his voice gravelly. "You were right to come to me. This will be looked into." The way he said "looked into" promised a world of quiet, professional terror for Alexei Volkov. "There is one more thing," Elena said, pressing her advantage. "It was a gamble. The driver, Leo. His transfer. I believe Mr. Volkov suggested it because Leo once saw him in the garden, acting strangely late at night. Leo mentioned it to me in confusion. I think Mr. Volkov wanted him gone to avoid questions." She was weaving truth and lie together with a skill she didn't know she possessed. Boris's eyes hardened. It made perfect, cynical sense to him. A security risk removing a potential witness. "The transfer order has not been finalized," he said slowly. "It would be a shame to lose a good driver on the eve of the ball," Elena said, turning to go. "Over a misunderstanding." She walked away, her legs feeling like water, but her spine was straight. The deed was done. The next morning, Saturday, the day of the winter ball, a different note found its way to her, slipped under her bedroom door. It was on simple line paper, in a handwriting she knew. Asterisk transfer cancelled. Leaving your service today by mutual agreement. A friend is driving me to New York. I have a job interview there Monday, with a car service. Thank you for everything. OL. Asterisk. He was safe. He was free. And he was leaving. The relief was so immense it made her dizzy. But so was the loss. He was thanking her, saying goodbye, and stepping out of the story forever. The ball began at 8. The house was a blaze of light and music. Elena stood at the top of the grand staircase in her emerald gown, her hair piled high. She looked like a princess in a fairy tale. Below, the party swirled, men in dark uniforms, women in jewels. She saw her father. She saw her mother laughing. And she saw Alexei Volkov, looking pale and tense near the punch bowl, being watched intently by a stone-faced Boris from across the room. She took a deep breath. The opening waltz was about to begin. The orchestra tuned their instruments, the sound a sweet, collective sigh. Her father nodded to her from the bottom of the stairs, expecting her to descend, to begin her part in the plan. But Elena had written a new plan. She saw a side door, leading to the kitchen passages, slightly ajar. And she saw, through the front window, a simple yellow taxi idling at the end of the driveway, its roof light off. Waiting. She gathered the heavy silk of her dress in one hand. The first notes of the waltz floated up, filling the air with expectation. She took one last look at the glittering world below, a world of velvet curtains and silent rules. She thought of a pencil line in a book, of a hand gripping hers in the dark, of a list written on stolen paper that had bought a man's freedom. She turned away from the staircase. "Don't look back," she whispered to herself, a fierce, quiet command. And as the music swelled behind her, Elena Romanov walked not down into the ballroom, but straight ahead, through the side door, and into the dark, hopeful unknown of her own choosing. 5 years later, in a small apartment on the Rue Mouffetard in Paris, a pair of heavy velvet curtains hung by the window. They were a deep, faded crimson, bought for a single franc at the Marche Auxiliary Puces de Saint-Ouen, the flea market. Sunlight, the pale gold light of a February morning, streamed through them, illuminating a galaxy of tiny, dancing dust motes and highlighting the fabric's worn patches and moth holes. The grandeur was threadbare now, but the color, in the right light, was still warm. Elena, at 22, sat at a small wooden table pushed against the wall, her textbook spread out in a semicircle. She was in her third year at the Sorbonne, studying literature. A cup of black coffee, now cold, sat beside her annotated copy of Anna Akhmatova's poems. Her pen moved quickly in the margin, making a note about metaphor and silence. Her hair, longer now, was tied up in a messy knot, and she wore a simple, thick sweater against the chill the old radiator couldn't quite bait. The front door of the apartment clicked open, letting in a brief gust of cold air from the stairwell and the sounds of the market street below, the call of a cheese vendor, the distant ring of a bicycle bell. Leo came in, stomping his boots on the mat. He wore a dark blue mechanic's uniform with the name Jacques embroidered over the pocket. He worked at a garage near the Gare de Lyon, and the scent of the day clung to him: engine oil, cold metal, and the faint, clean smell of winter air. He set a paper bag of fresh bread on the counter. He paused, watching her for a moment. She was so deeply absorbed, her forehead resting on her hand, her pen tapping a quiet rhythm on the page. His eyes drifted to the curtains, backlit by the sun. A small, private smile touched his lips, a smile that had become easier and more frequent with each passing year. He didn't say a word. He just hung his coat on the hook and began unpacking the bread and a small wheel of cheese. Elena looked up, sensing him. "You're home early," she said, her face softening. "Slow day," he replied, his French now fluent, though still accented. "Jacques sent me home. Said I was making the place look too busy." He brought her a slice of the warm bread, spread with a little butter. She took it with a grateful smile, her fingers brushing his. They were familiar touches now, comfortable and quiet. They never spoke of that last night in Washington. They never dissected the terror of the garden, the cunning of her list, the frantic taxi ride to Union Station where he was waiting, not for a job interview in New York, but for her, with 2 one-way tickets to Montreal. They never talked about the first, hard year in Canada, where she waited tables and he fixed trucks, saving every penny for her university dream in Paris. The past was not a ghost that haunted them. It was a foundation, buried deep and solid under their feet. But the scars were there, if you knew how to look. They were in the way Elena sometimes, in a crowded room, would still find a spot by a window and observe, her body remembering its old posture. They were in the way Leo's eyes would occasionally snap to a man in a suit who looked a certain way, a flicker of old caution before he relaxed. And they were in the tangible things, the small, white scar on his palm from scaling the rough brick of the garden wall that last time, and the pair of faded velvet curtains that now framed their view of Parisian rooftops. Elena finished her note and closed the book. She walked over to the window, pulling the curtain aside a little more to look out. The winter light was thin, but it held a determined promise. Spring was still weeks away, but the sharp edge of January's cold was gone. Down in the street, a flower seller was setting out buckets of early, hardy tulips, splashes of yellow and red against the grey cobblestones. "I was thinking," she said, her back to him, "for my thesis. I want to write about quiet resistance. Not the grand protests, but the small, personal ways people preserve themselves in worlds that want to make them small. The books they read. The art they make. The choices they don't announce." Leo came to stand beside her, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at her profile, at the focused light in her eyes. "Sounds like you have first-hand sources," he said quietly. She leaned into him, just slightly. "The best kind." He put an arm around her shoulders, the wool of her sweater rough under his hand. They stood there, in their patch of sunlight, watching the life of their street unfold below. The curtains behind them, once a symbol of a gilded, stifling world, were now just fabric. They kept out the worst of the cold at night. They softened the morning light. They were a part of the home they had built together, stitch by imperfect stitch. The past was not a chain. It was a choice they remembered every day. She had chosen the uncertain taxi over the certain ballroom. He had chosen to wait at the station, not knowing if she would come. Every day since had been another choice in the same direction, towards each other, towards this simple, unscripted life of bread and books and morning light. Elena thought of the girl behind the other curtain, in the other life, tasting stolen champagne and dreaming in poetry. That girl wasn't lost. She was right here. She had just finally stepped into the frame of her own story. The scar of that old life wasn't a wound. It was a seam, marking where two different versions of herself had been joined together, stronger for the mending. Outside, a church bell began to chime noon, its sound clear and bright in the cold air. Down on the street, the flower vendor waved up at a neighbor. A black cat slunk along the gutter. It was an ordinary morning, full of small, beautiful details. And for the first time in her life, Elena wasn't watching it from a distance. She was standing right in the middle of it, her feet firmly on her own floor, the weight of Leo's arm around her, and the future, their future, wide open and waiting, just beyond the faded, beautiful velvet.